Today's episode is powered by Lightyear, the investment platform offering stocks and shares ISA with zero order fees. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
Last year, Brits poured more than £100 billion into ISAs, yet two-thirds is just sitting in cash. Are we simply risk-averse, or are there structural problems discouraging us from investing?
I want to know how we can help people make smarter use of their money. And in today's dumb question of the week, does cash have zero volatility? All right, let's get into it. So anyone that's been listening to us for any length of time will know that cash is typically a poor long-term investment, and there are much better options for your money. But maybe people aren't paying attention to us, Roman, because if we look at what Brits are doing with their money, they're overwhelmingly keeping it in cash.
And long term, that's a really big mistake, because if you do want to invest for a long period of time, you're almost certainly better off with equity. Now, that's a difficult thing to state because equity comes with so much volatility. So for any period of time, you've got this thing which gyrates hugely versus something which just plods along at a very steady pace. So it is very much tortoise versus hare, but the hare ultimately wins. And I think that was the bit that Aesop left out.
Yeah, maybe that fable has just conditioned everyone's minds in the wrong way when it comes to money. Now, last week, HMRC published some really interesting research about how people are using their ISA allowances. And this is for the tax year 2023 to 24, so the last tax year. Now, in that year, around 15 million British adults put money into an ISA. That was actually up from the year before, which was more like 12.4 million. But the headline we've taken away from it, Roman, is that of those accounts, 66.2% were cash ISAs. And that's actually an increase from the year before.
Yeah, I mean, it's good news and bad news, I think, from that point of view. It's great news that more people are saving and investing for the future, and also making use of this incredible gift, which is an individual savings account. And yet at the same time, my heart fell when I saw the numbers because, look, putting money into cash ISAs is not a great use of your money.
If it's for the long term.
Yeah, that's the big proviso, if it's for the long term. If it's for short-term storage of cash, where you want to get a bit of interest tax-free, then absolutely that would make sense. But I suspect that a lot of this money is going to be squirreled away for years, and it's going to be underperforming as a result of being put into cash.
Yeah, there's some really interesting research which we'll come on to from the Financial Conduct Authority, which shows that, yes, a lot of this is long-term money and is underperforming, as you'd expect. But let's just look at these ISA stats in a bit more detail. So there were around 10 million cash ISAs paid into in that tax year, and there were around 4 million stocks and shares ISAs paid into. So it's a big discrepancy. There was also 0.01 million innovative finance ISAs. People are rightly ignoring those.
That was such a terrible idea, having two products rolled into one, which makes people just think, what is going on here? And so many people get penalties when they pull out the money early.
But if we look at how much money was actually put into these accounts, then there was £103 billion subscribed to ISAs in the tax year. That was a massive increase from the year before, so more than £30 billion more. And again, the lion's share went into cash. Around two-thirds of the money went into cash ISAs.
And if you look at the HMRC document, they try to explain the reason for the large increase in cash ISAs. They say that it can be explained by the Bank of England bank rate and also interest rate swap rates, which were at the highest during the 23-24 tax year. So higher interest rates, you put more money in cash. So far, so logical. They also say increased returns to savings are likely to have increased the attractiveness of ISAs as a means to reduce savings income tax liabilities.
Yeah, because you get taxed if you have more than £500 or £1,000, depending on your tax bracket, in interest each year. So one way to avoid that is to put your savings into cash ISAs, which people seem to have done. Now, if I look back through history, it is not always the case that people put more money into cash ISAs than stocks and shares ISAs. The standout year actually is 2021 to 22, where 34 billion went into stocks and shares ISAs and only 30 billion went into cash ISAs.
So I guess part of this was that pandemania rally when we had blistering returns and people had FOMO and they obviously wanted to get tax-free capital gains, which obviously is a good thing. I'm surprised that the interest fizzled out after that because people must have seen the success of that strategy. So why would they suddenly think, I'll put money into a cash ISA instead of the thing which gave me the really high returns?
Well, what it looks to me is that people are chasing returns. So you can see when the stock market does well, the next year there's a huge uptick in stocks and shares ISA contributions. And then when there's a crash, the next year there's an uptick in cash ISAs. People are sort of behind the curve.
So you always react to what happened last year. Interesting. And slightly disappointing, I have to say.
So to summarize so far, generally, far more people use cash ISAs and far more money goes into cash ISAs. However, if you look at the total stock of ISAs that have ever been opened and all the money that sits in them, there's £872 billion in ISAs as of April 2024. And most of that money is in stocks and shares ISAs. Almost 60% is in stocks and shares ISAs. Now, I suspect what that's telling you is, despite less money being paid in to stocks and shares ISAs, it just grows much faster and therefore dwarfs what's in cash ISAs over time.
And I guess that makes our point, which is that if you're going to put money into one of these things, you may as well put it into something which will give you the best benefit over time, particularly if you don't want to pay capital gains tax. And that's where a lot of the growth comes from stocks.
But I guess one thing I am curious about is what people are actually holding in their stocks and shares ISAs. It doesn't give that level of granularity. We know from other stats that people are tending to favor passive investing like index funds. But maybe these cash figures are even slightly understated because in those stocks and shares ISAs, some people will be holding cash and money market funds and cash-like investments.
Yeah, when I look at people's ISAs, the ones that talk to me anyway, what I usually see is that they've got a big tilt to the US right now. So again, they'd favour whatever's been rallying hardest most recently. So it could be single Mag 7 stocks, or it could be US stocks or tech stocks in general. However, if they've got religion, if they've seen some of our content, usually they will have this kind of core versus fund portfolio split. And many people are now getting nervous about US stocks. So sometimes they've got a big tilt away from the US now. But it would be fascinating to see what's actually in those portfolios. If they could do those kind of aggregated stats, I'd love to see them.
Now, we focused on ISAs so far, and we said 15 million adults paid into an ISA in that tax year. But there's far more than 15 million adults in the UK. So we're actually just looking at the subset of people here who have sufficient money to squirrel away in an ISA. But the FCA has done some broader research where they look at the whole population and say, well, how many Brits are actually investing? And it says in 2024, 39% of British adults, that's 21 million people, held any investments. If we exclude adults who have an investment property or other real investments, but with no actual investment products, this proportion falls to 35% of the population. And that's actually been falling in recent years. So fewer people hold investments. And I should make the point that this explicitly excludes defined contribution pensions and SIPs.
Yeah, in that sense, a lot of us are investors without knowing about it. If you ask someone walking down the street, do you invest? They'll say no, even though their pension is almost certainly invested in stocks and bonds. But that is a shockingly low number. I'm really horrified by that. If you compare that with the US, I suspect it's far lower.
And here we actually do have some granularity. So if we look at the percentage of adults with investments, and we're excluding investment properties and defined contribution pensions again, as we said, 35% of British adults have investments. If we look at it by gender, 43% of men own investments, while only 28% of women do. And if we look at it by age, it does kind of what you'd expect, where the very youngest cohort, the 18 to 24-year-olds, only 22% of them own investments. And then it gradually increases through the generations. And if you look at people aged 75 or over, 51% of them have investments.
So another disappointment here is the male-female split, and 43 versus 28% is pretty shocking.
Presumably there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that we still have a bit of a gender pay gap and a savings gap. So obviously, if men on average have more money, they're more likely to own investments. But also, I think it's quite well known from psychological research that at least what women say about how they feel about investing is that they're more conscious of risk.
But look, if you've worked in an investment bank, you just walk through the trading floor, and usually it follows the Steve rule. There are more Steves than there are women. It has changed, I think, over time, but not a lot. And it's just like going to Imperial College. I did physics, which wasn't too bad in terms of gender mixtures. But if you go for an engineering subject, like electrical engineering, I knew the one girl in my year who was doing electrical engineering, and that was it.
Do you think this has an impact, though? Is it just that the finance industry is not so good at talking to women because there are fewer women in there making the decisions?
Yeah, I don't think there's any other fundamental reason. But I wonder if there is some kind of analogy here with people who do science subjects or engineering subjects and the gender divide there, because finance just isn't taught in a way which is attractive to women. I think now there are more influencers who are female, and that's going to redress the balance. In fact, I've met some of them at some of these social events, and they're incredibly good. They do tend to look at things differently to the way I'd explain them, but I think that's all positive. So I think this is something that will change. It just takes time to affect that change.
I've noticed that on PensionCraft, there are lots of women signing up, but the balance is still in favour of men, I would say. You talked about the Steve rule on the investment banking floor. In PensionCraft, it's probably the Chris rule. Have you noticed that every other person that signs up is called Chris? Why is that?
Yeah, we're running out of Chris's. We've got so many Chris's that people have to use alternative handles on our chat application.
Yeah, it's like Chris147. But to move away from the gender question, we can also see the data broken down by other characteristics. So we mentioned age, which does what you'd expect. Like the older you get, the more likely you are to have investments. It's also true of income. The more money you have, the more likely you are to have investments. But then they do break it down by things like employment status.
And there, I don't think there are any huge surprises. If you're semi-retired, you've got the highest probability of having investments, 55%. The lowest category is for people who are unemployed, 20%. And interestingly, self-employed people are slightly more likely to have investments than employed people. I guess if you're employed, you're going to have your workplace pension. If you're self-employed, you're going to have to do something active yourself to get a pension. And housing tenure, that's another interesting one. Renters are least likely to have investments. And if you own your house outright, that goes up to 54%.
I suspect a lot of that would disappear if you controlled for age and income and things
wealth.
like that. Exactly, yeah. Many of these things are highly correlated. But it brings us on to the question of, are people underinvesting because they just don't have the money to invest? Or do they have the cash but are just put off from putting it into markets?
So it isn't the case that people don't have the money. When they've got the money, they put it into cash. They don't put it into investments, which is interesting.
Yeah, there's one really interesting graph in that FCA data, which shows that many of the people who have more than £10,000 in investable assets continue to hold all, or at least 3/4 of their money in cash savings, including, surprisingly, some of those people who have loads and loads of money.
So let's start simple. If we look at all of the UK adults with more than £10,000 in investable assets, a huge proportion of them, 41%, put all of their money in the form of cash.
But then it doesn't get much better with the rest of the data. A further 19% of people are mostly in cash, which means more than 75% of their money's in cash. And how many people do you think have less than 25% of their money invested in cash? Because remember, if you're putting together a long-term portfolio, 25% will be a lot of cash. So how many people have less than that?
This is quite shocking. It's 15%.
Yeah. So just 15% of people have got a portfolio which kind of abides by the general principles of portfolio construction.
Yeah, 60-40 would take you above that threshold. And that's probably the default for someone who's the average investor, I'd say. But what's interesting is if you go up the investable assets scale, and it's only until you get to people who have more than 250,000 in investable assets that people really lean into investing. And even then, only 24% of that group of people have their money mostly in investments. Today's episode is sponsored by Lightyear, the investment app built for a great user experience available on both web and mobile. They've just made their stocks and shares ISA completely commission-free, so you can invest in over 6,000 stocks and ETFs without trading fees eating into your returns. Fund manager fees and a 0.35% FX fee may still apply. You can also transfer your ISA in or out at any time, giving you extra flexibility to manage your money the way you want. You can try Lightyear using the code PensionCraft or follow the link in the description to get up to $115 worth of a US fractional share in your general investment account. Terms and conditions apply. See the description for details. Remember that investing involves risk, and the value of your investments can go down as well as up.
But all of this just brings us to the question of why? Why are Brits favouring cash savings overwhelmingly? When it only takes a little bit of research to know that investing over the long term is going to outperform that. The FCA's research does shed some light on this.
Is it pathological risk aversion?
Well, that's not how they phrase it, but I think that is the top answer. So there was a question they asked to everyone in the survey who had more than £10,000 in cash, but no investments. And they basically said, why? The top answer, I worry about losing money. That's what 34% of people said.
And number two, so this is 29% of respondents, they said, I'm happy with the interest I receive on my savings. This is why I want to have the Dimson-Marsh-Staunton numbers tattooed on some part of my anatomy. Ideally, a visible part of my anatomy.
I was going to say, I've tattooed it on the wrong place and now I've been arrested for showing it to everyone. I'm just educating people about investing in the woods.
Man arrested in Holmer Green, yeah.
But I think, if you don't have a lot of knowledge, I worry about losing money is a completely fair thing to say. Investments are risky and people know that. They just don't know the return side of the equation, I think.
That's right. I think that's because of the education we receive in the UK. I was never taught any of this stuff. What's the expected return on equity? What's the expected return on cash, bonds? I didn't even know what a bond was until I went to work for an investment bank.
I've become an expert at pretending to know what bonds are. Anyway, let's look at some of the other reasons people have given here. 24% say, I don't know enough about investments. Fair enough. 21% say, my financial affairs are straightforward and I don't need to invest.
No.
Maybe that's an interesting one, though. I don't need to invest. I guess we sometimes say if you can hit your goals with a minimum amount of risk, there's nothing wrong with that.
But I think in order to achieve those goals, the average person will need pretty good returns, and ideally to do that over the entire course of their lifetime. They say they don't need to invest, but the truth is that they don't know that they need to invest. And that's not their problem. Maybe we should be responsible for our own education, but I still think this should be part of the syllabus at school.
There are some other options stated. 12% of people say, I feel overwhelmed by the number of investment options available. And 8% of people say, I would like to invest, but I need support to make the right decisions.
So if we're talking about the death of the UK stock market, it doesn't take a huge leap to realise why it could be happening. This is the kind of risk aversion I'd expect from a country where the entire stock market had collapsed.
Chicken and egg, isn't it?
But difficult to break out of. I don't see how people could be convinced that this isn't a bad idea to put some of their money at risk, take temporary losses in order to get that risk premium longer term.
Some people might look at this data and say, well, surely Brits have never invested, right? Why would this be causing the UK stock market to suffer? It's not like fewer people are investing than in the past. But you've got to remember the structure of the market has changed. In the past, going back decades, there were defined benefit pensions, which were invested in British equities. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is they've overwhelmingly shifted out of equities and into government bonds as those schemes have closed and they're just looking to meet their liabilities. But what has typically not happened is that people have taken on the mantle themselves and put their money at risk in the stock market.
Do you know what? I think another reason culturally, which might explain this, would be that the same reason why people think it's okay at a dinner party to say, oh, I'm no good at maths, but they'd never say, oh, I don't read books. Maybe this is because finance and investment is seen as being a bit spotty or as something which isn't cool.
I'd like to say we push back on that, but we've just cited a million graphs on an audio-only podcast.
And I am very spotty. So, I can't really claim that I'm making investment cool again.
But to keep things nice and nerdy, Romin, I've got a couple more stats I want to throw at you. In 2024, 54% of adults with more than £10,000 in cash savings and who had not received any investment advice say they'd never thought about investing before. And more than half of those people who could invest have not even thought about it.
And again, this is broken down by demographic groups, and I'd characterize this as more pathological risk aversion. So, for example, in the group that were not willing to take any risks with investing, so their risk tolerance was measured as 0 out of 10, 70% of those were most likely to have never thought about investing.
It's a bit of a strange one, isn't it? So this is people that say, I'm not willing to take any risk, but then clearly they've not even thought about taking risk. So I don't know which comes first, really. It's just scared of things you don't know anything about, I guess. But if you genuinely are not willing to lose any money, then you shouldn't be investing. That's true.
And the other groups would be people who are older, age 55 plus. I'm in that category now, so not that old. And then finally, people who've got the lowest household income. So that would be less than 50,000 a year.
So there's a lot of people out there who are just not even considering investing as an option. There's also some more data which again looks at this split by gender. So for the population as a whole, 19% of investors said they could not afford to lose any of the money they've invested. Let's hope they've invested in low-risk assets then. But of those people, again, it skews towards women. Whereas only 12% of men say they could not afford to lose any of the money they invest, almost 30% of women say that.
Now, I speak to a lot of people about investing, and if I had to characterize it, the gender divide, I'd say that men, even if they don't know what they're talking about, are more confidently wrong than women who would admit that they don't know what they're doing. So I think this is partly a cultural thing, but it's also an education thing. And I'd expect as people get better educated about investing, the gender divide will become much smaller.
Which leads us on to the question of what should we be doing as a society, or what should the government be doing policy-wise to encourage more people to invest?
I have seen some advertisements with Ross Kemp saying, pay your pension some attention. And he's doing a workout and he's making the point that it's not just about keeping fit as you get older, it's also about financial fitness, which I think is a good message. I'm not sure he's my demographic, but obviously it should work for some people.
So this is kind of a marketing thing, I guess, from the government, right?
Yeah, I think it's promoted by the government, but it's paid for by the Association of British Insurers and also the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association and, I guess, pension funds.
But is this the kind of thing you think will make a difference, getting splashy ads on television?
I don't know. I just remember those SID ads on TV when we had the privatisations, and that did increase awareness. People were quoting the ad and they got excited about these shares. So maybe that could be what it takes. I just think less people watch terrestrial TV now. So maybe if it's on YouTube, that could get people's attention.
I'd be surprised if it makes a big difference, but I guess it's worth trying. There's maybe a more structural change to the market going on right now, being driven by the FCA, where there's this perception that there's an advice gap around investing, where, as we know, regulated financial advice is very expensive and most people just can't afford it. But they're unwilling to invest without a nudge, like without someone showing them what to do and to hold their hand while they're doing it. So how can you close that gap? And the FCA is currently consulting on proposals for a new form of support called targeted support, which is kind of somewhere in the middle, where pensions providers and investment platforms will be allowed to sort of group up their consumers by common characteristics and then give them this targeted support, which comes very close to bespoke advice, but doesn't quite cross the threshold. But it's certainly more than they can do at the moment.
So in case you're not familiar with the legislation, the reason why a lot of advisors are quite scared of their own compliance department is if it can be shown that the advice that they've given isn't suitable for the customer that they've got, then they can have legal action against them, they can be sued. And that actually happens quite frequently. So they have to pay a lot of insurance, and that's going to put up their costs. So you can see why, from the advisor's point of view, this is a high-risk business. And I think this is a positive move, moving towards targeted support, because I think that's probably enough for most people.
And just to quickly go back to those stats we mentioned earlier of why people say they're not investing, if you group up all the people who say, we don't know enough about investing and we need support and we feel overwhelmed, put all those people together, that's nearly a third of people.
So I think some of these examples of targeted support are quite helpful because they show you what could be provided and how useful it could be. So currently, a firm could suggest that consumers may be in a position to start investing. But under this new regime, targeted support, a firm could actually suggest a specific investment product for that consumer. That's much more useful concrete advice.
I think so long as there are the safeguards around it, which is a lot of what this consultation is focusing on. Like, how do you stop firms just promoting a product that's in their interest that you buy rather than in the consumer's interests?
Oh yeah, that's a given. And if it's the FCA, they'll probably be too cautious in terms of the rules around it. And the other examples are helpful too. So for example, currently firms can provide information about investments consumers hold in order to highlight risks and signpost explanatory materials. Under the new regime, they could suggest an alternative investment product. So those switches could actually be quite helpful.
So that's a big goal of this new targeted support regime, is to get people investing and to get them investing in optimal products. It's also looking at how can we help people who are under saving for retirement and might not know about it. So currently firms can warn a consumer that they may be under saving for retirement, but not really tell them what to do about it. Whereas once the new regime comes in, it looks like they'll be able to suggest how much they should put into their pension by a contribution rate and then what they should do with it.
And that applies to drawdown as well. So currently they can only provide broad information about different types of decumulation options. Whereas under targeted support, they'll be able to say, use this approach. So use phased UF plus, for example.
I think that will actually be really helpful for people because drawdown options and like how to actually spend your pension pot, minimize your taxes, make it last as long as it needs to. That's really, really hard stuff to do on your own for most people.
It took me ages to get my head around it. And the name of my company is PensionCraft. So it's not like I didn't try, but it is a very dry subject and it's very technical. It's difficult to do.
So overall, I think these will be encouraging reforms if they go through. The FCA is aiming to publish its policy statement by the end of this year. So we'll see like what makes it into the actual targeted support framework at the end of things. But it is important. The consultation document provides some really eye-opening stats. The one that grabbed my attention is that 38% of the working age population are under saving for retirement. That's the kind of thing that comes back to bite a society in the future.
Yeah, I think in terms of return on investment, if you do spend money trying to educate the public about saving, I think it'll have huge consequences down the road, positive consequences, because people will be able to live off those savings in future and not depend on the state.
We've got a long way to go, haven't we? 34% of people aged between 50 and 69 with a defined contribution pension had never heard of income drawdown, and 32% have never heard of an annuity. But these are the people that are going to be asked to make their own decisions about what to do with their pots very soon, if not already.
Why am I saving again?
Yeah, exactly. People don't think about it until the time comes to actually make the decision and press the button, right? And then they probably panic and choose whatever seems sensible at the time.
I guess that's okay. As long as they're saving, they can work out the details later on. But it is good to understand them, obviously, well before you have to take the money out. But again, this is a tricky idea, which is sustainable withdrawal rate. How much can you draw out of a pot consisting of X pounds in order to last the rest of your life? There are so many degrees of uncertainty, how long you're going to live, what the returns will be, what inflation will be, what your costs will be. It isn't easy to do.
But I think all this stuff about British people underinvesting is true. The stats show it's true. But it's not unique to the UK. The FCA has seen similar problems in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the EU. But there's one country they don't mention there, which is the US, where far more people are investing in stocks and risk assets for the long term. Why are Americans more comfortable with this?
I think it is a cultural difference. When I lived in California, we lived in LA for a while, I noticed that at social events, people would talk about stocks and investing, whereas in the UK, I've never, ever heard anyone discussing it, unless they chat to me, because they know that's what I do. Also, I think they've had the 401k pension scheme in the United States where you have to decide what you buy and ideally generate the best possible returns to do it. Those have been around for longer in the United States than we've had SIPs in the UK.
Yeah, maybe that's part of it. I also think there's just a lot less hand-holding going on in the US. Like, people have to file tax returns typically, whereas here, most people who are being paid by their employer through PAYE typically don't have to file a self-assessment tax return, which is a good thing that the system is sort of doing it all for you. But maybe it does infantilize people and just stop them thinking through their finances, because you don't see it. You don't see so much of it. You don't put it all on a piece of paper at the end of every year. The other thing I reckon in Britain is that we're obsessed by property. The default thing when people think about investments, I think, is still buy to let.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although less so now. I think the legal changes recently have made it much less attractive. Plus, funding rates. I think people now realise that when you don't have zero interest rates, property doesn't do quite so well.
Yeah, when you look at the numbers, I don't see why anyone would want to become a buy-to-let landlord now. Yet you do still see people talking about it, and it's still an ambition of a lot of people.
But I think the same thing that drove people into buy-to-let may drive them into owning stocks, which is they'll look at other people's pensions, they'll see the quality of life that it can buy if you have been investing in the stock market long term, and then they'll realise, probably too late for many people, that that's what maybe they should have done. Now, we talked about all these difficult decisions you have to make about how to decide how much to spend in retirement so you don't exhaust your pot. Well, we have tools available in PensionCraft which allow you to do that. If you did want to join our community and speak to people who've already retired, it's really easy to find out more. Just go to pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. Does cash have zero volatility?
Pretty much. I'd say the answer's yes. That could be our shortest dumb question ever.
Well, let's try and lengthen it out a little bit. Because obviously, in one sense, it's a truism, right? If you're measuring in pounds and you're saving in pounds, then in nominal terms, the volatility is zero by definition. But I think there are some arguments you could make that cash does have a volatility, certainly in real terms.
Yeah, I mean, if you introduce inflation, there are periods when inflation spikes and that's going to push down the value of your cash in real terms. Plus, the actual inflation numbers are published once a month, so you could see a spike in that, and that would create volatility in the real value of your money.
Which is what you care about, right? You care about purchasing power.
Yeah, technically you're right. I think there would be volatility in that case, and kind of weird volatility because you only realise about it once the inflation numbers are published.
Is it also not true that there's volatility in the sense that the interest rate you'll be receiving or the yield on your cash will change over time? It will be volatile.
Yeah, the rate of return will be volatile, but that's not exactly the same as the volatility of the value of the asset itself. Another interesting corollary of the fact that volatility is very low for cash is that correlation is very low, because correlation and volatility are related. So if you look at the correlation of any asset with cash, it'll be zero. And that's because the volatility is multiplied together when you work out correlation. So in that sense, it's the ideal diversifying asset, and that's as well as being a very good low-risk asset. So I think cash is the unsung hero of portfolios. It's pretty good at beating inflation longer term as well, which is a surprise to many people.
Is that developed market privilege coming in there, though? There are a lot of countries where cash has become worthless over time.
And at the moment, it's pretty small. If you look at inflation in the UK, it's just a shade below what you're getting as cash rates.
So CPI inflation is 3.8%, and the Bank of England base rate is 4%. Weirdly, we're right on the verge of negative real rates again.
But the expectation is that this is the local peak of inflation. It's gradually going to diminish, and interest rates will come down as well. But historically, there's been about 0.5 percentage point difference between the two, which isn't bad for a very, very, very low-risk investment.
Yeah, I think it's true that in the UK and the US, cash has had a very slight positive return over the long term, right? But there are periods where that's not true, which is when inflation picks up, but the central bank, for whatever reason, doesn't raise rates as much as you'd think it would. We could be in that situation soon.
It's possible. All things are possible, as we've learned recently.
There's certainly political pressure to bring rates down in the US, despite inflation starting to tick up again.
In fact, there is another source of volatility here, which is if you store your money with a bank, you could argue that there is a default risk for the bank. And that would be any money you store above the FSCS guarantee, for example. So is that volatility? I'm not sure. It's certainly risk. You wouldn't measure it as a daily change in the value of the cash.
You could do, if you looked at credit default swaps, you could sort of mark to market your account balance at a bank.
Yeah, I guess you could do that. But I think this is probably going to be our nerdiest episode ever, Michael.
The other point maybe is that a lot of people hold cash in cash-like investments like money market funds, short-term government bonds, which do have volatility. There is duration there. Short duration, but still.
Yes, some short-term, ultra-short-term gilt funds will have a bit of volatility. Money market funds usually have very little indeed. But look, in answer to the original question, even though the volatility of cash may not be zero, it's still very close to zero, as near as you're ever going to get.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.